I'm here to kind of introduce full stack feminism, and particularly to talk about one of the stacks that we describe in the project, Data and Archives. So I'm just going to do like a quick intro to who we are as a team. We're a multidisciplinary, multi-partner team running across the University of Sussex, University of Maynooth, University of Cambridge, and the Technical College University of Dublin. We also have partners with the Irish Museum of Modern Archives, IMA, and also with the Digital Repository of Ireland. And the director, Natalie, is sitting here in the audience. So in many respects, we're a trans interdisciplinary project. And I'll also just say we also have Lawrence Hill, who is our digital curator as well. So we prioritize working in a very kind of agile and flexible manner. The types of work that we're doing is inclusive, and it kind of tries to look at ways in which we can kind of broaden the idea of digital humanities. So we kind of think about digital humanities as a kind of DH plus. So digital arts practice is important, community archives is important, and community engagement in those spaces is important as well. Just to note our full stack feminism advisory board as well. Again, experts across the field who provide expert knowledge and advice. So what we are then essentially, so we are full stack feminism in digital humanities, and it's a 2-year funded project by the Arts, Humanities Research Council and the Irish Research Council as part of their, I can't see my slides, as part of their UK-Ireland collaboration in digital humanities research grants. And so we are one of 11 projects that are running over the next 2 years. So the aim of full stack feminism is to think about how we might create a more inclusive, more diverse, and more kind of equal, using the kind of EDI terms, digital humanities. And we want to do that by thinking about applying, developing and embedding intersectional feminist approaches and praxis. And in terms of, the project, we are very intersectional feminist focused. And what we want to do is we want to see how we can embed that across the methodological frameworks in digital humanities and in the environments in which DH is developed within the projects and within the team. So we think about it as a kind of a 2 or 3 tiered setup. So thinking about how DH can be more inclusive in terms of the projects that are being built, in terms of the methodology, but also in terms of the teams and the people that are involved. And we use full stack knowing that it's a very specific term in terms of software development. So we use it as a metaphor, and we use it to look at the ways in which, the kind of structural inequalities or kind of structural bias are embedded across kind of the various stacks of the kind of infrastructure lifecycle. So what we mean in this, we are concerned with issues related to inequalities and bias in digital humanities that span from the infrastructure layer, the kind of the base layer, the foundational layer, right through to the representation layer and everything in between. And we use the kind of, it's the internet, feminist internet framework when they talk about reclaiming the code down to its code base. So that's the type of approach that we're taking as well. So we use full stack as a metaphor, knowing that it has specific terms in relation to web development, for example. And just to note as well that full stack feminism in digital humanities, or full stack, follows on from the kind of previous research network, Intersections, Feminism, Technologies and Digital Humanities, IFTI for short. And that was a research project, a research network that ran from 2020 to 2021. And some of the team that are currently on it on full stack were part of that team as well. And you can look at ifti.network there for more information. So that's just to kind of give some context and background. And I'm getting beeped at. So what I want to kind of do now is to kind of think about the kind of reasons why this project was important and why we put it together. And it also situates our work within specific frameworks and the specific frameworks in which we work and the types of literature that we might refer to and the types of interventions and the spaces that we want to kind of intervene in. So we think about the kind of historical context of some of these things. There is a historical context of feminist perspectives in technology. And this specifically comes from spaces like Judy Wiseman, for example, in the 1980s, who's thinking about feminism confronting technologies. So she talks about the way in which technologies result from a series of specific decisions made by particular groups of people in particular places at particular times for their own purposes. And further on, she says that technologies therefore bear the imprint of the people and the social context in which they were developed. And this is specifically important to the type of research that we are doing this project, because the kind of bias that is embedded in our algorithms, the types of bias that is embedded in the kind of maybe the digital archives, digital systems that were used, are obviously replicating the software developers, the teams that were part of that decision making. And it's an embeddedness that has historic roots, and an embeddedness that needs kind of contemporary interventions. Judy Wiseman coined the phrase techno-feminism, and it's an area in which we feel that this project intervenes in. And so techno-feminism, in the kind of broadest sense, interrogates the power relations of the material world, or interrogates the power relations of the technological world, the kind of digital world that we're in. And in thinking about kind of digital humanities, again, there is a sense that within DH, there are calls for thinking about feminism around specifically science and technology studies. Catherine, sorry, I think it keeps getting in my way. So the authors of Data Feminism, if you've seen that publication, reference SDS studies. They reference a kind of feminism in SDS, D'Angelo and Klein. And what they talk about is the way SDS has historically and implicitly and explicitly looked to the perspectives of those marginalized by current power configurations. And SDS looks to a way of exposing how perspectives can be included and what is considered, if you can read the bottom bit, I can't remember what that is, but definitely look up that quotation. And there's also a kind of societal context for this project as well. And in noting, Sophia Noble's work, Algorithm of Oppression, noting Rua Benjamin's work, Race After Technology, Cathy O'Neill, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Mara Hicks, Programming Equality, and so on. We're thinking about the ways in which algorithms and algorithmic oppression is something that has kind of entered the zeitgeist. So it's something that people are aware of now. And in 2018, Safi Noble highlighted how algorithmic bias is a systemic issue, and it's an issue that is reflective of embedded bias in society. So the way in which kind of techno-social problems that are replicated in these systems, these are the things that emerge through glitches, bugs, design flaws, and failures to be inclusive, or failures to kind of think about the types of users, different users who are part of the systems that we use. And we must ask them what is tolerable and what is acceptable and for who. In kind of thinking about so we have the kind of historical context, we have the societal context, and we also have a DH context. So over the last decade or so, there has been calls within DH to think about what would be a more broader, inclusive digital humanities, what would be a more diverse digital humanities. So, the literature that is emerging in DH demonstrates an increasing need for intersectional feminist practice within the field. And you can see that in publications like Rupika Risham's Intersectional and Digital Humanities, and the other literature that I reference here as well. And in the space of DH as well, Alan Liu thinks about kind of like, well, what would a diversity within digital humanities look like? And Alan Liu talks about the way in which kind of diversity in digital humanities means the inclusion of different cultures, identities, and people as research themes and as members of the scholarly community itself. So with an emphasis on underrepresented races, ethnicities, genders, national origins, languages, abilities, and socioeconomic classes. So Alan Liu talks about the way in which DH can be institutional, but also can be outside the institution. And within kind of, Alan Liu's framework of what would diversity within DH look like, he says it's a societal problem as well as a technical problem. And that technical problem comes into being in terms of, well, what would an inclusive methodology within DH look like? And so in that respect, this is where we frame full stack feminism. It's thinking about what would be an inclusive methodology within digital humanities. So when thinking about kind of like, well, what are our objectives then? So we want to think about, well, how might we publish and develop a full stack feminist methodology? How would we publish that as a toolkit, for example, for kind of project teams to interact with, or for, data management resources, various other things. We want to think about coding workshops within that. We want to think about, well, what would an intersectional feminist coding workshop look like? How is that different to other kind of coding practices? We're also creating a collection of what we're calling intersectional feminist objects and writing that, or kind of ingesting that into the Digital Repository of Ireland. And we also prioritise working in collaboration with community archives and organisation And again, thinking about what Lou talks about in terms of what outside of the academy, outside of institutions, those are the important voices, important perspectives that we want to bring in. So who does DH? Who is allowed to do DH? Who do we include? And how as kind of institutions we might exclude, because we think about DH in a very specific domain. And our high level objective as the project then is to highlight and address specific points in project development. So if you're used to looking at a kind of project development cycle in terms of kind of software engineering, we think about user design, we think about data modeling, we think about code production or code reproduction. What are you reproducing by producing someone else's code? You want to think about end user testing and experience. And so all through those stages, we think about how often unconsciously we might manifest inequalities or bias in these various stages. And so for the example that I use is data models. So how are the underlying data models or data structures of the information that we model, how is that representing a specific worldview? Is it inclusive, or is it very kind of narrow focused? And that has impacts in terms of like how people can be included in these systems, how people are described or not described. So inclusion and exclusion. And so what we've devised is kind of, as I said, the full stack metaphor. And we've framed it in terms of 3 stacks that we are investigating at each level in that kind of life cycle. So stack 1 is data and archives, and specifically data and archives is obviously very relevant to the event today, and that is the kind of stack in which, you know, we kind of see this this event today as intervening in. And each speaker here, I think, you know, will speak to the ways in which we can think about data and archives in relation to exclusionary and exclusionary methods and infrastructures. Stack 2 then is thinking about infrastructure, tools and code, and the ways in which, you know, the types of infrastructure that we use. And actually we can think about infrastructure both in a technological sense, but also in a societal, institutional sense as well, you know. And Stack 3 then access, experience and integration. So we can see how that, you know, moves from thinking about the kind of foundations of data archives through to the various layers, bringing us to the kind of end of user experience. And we have a kind of a crucial, critical framework that cuts across all 3 of those stacks, which is archives, community, digital arts practice, and feminist praxis, of course. Let's not forget that. So there are threads, as I said, that cut across. If I could just move you out of the way, please. Can I get rid of it? Oh, yes. Yay. Okay. Halfway through. So anyway, so here's our kind of like our threads. So these are the things that we prioritize as a group. They're the things that kind of help us to create coherency across our stacks. And as I said, they provide a crucial framework for analysis. Beep, beep, beep. I'm not going to go through all these questions, but these are just kind of like an example of the types of questions that we hope an investigation across those stacks will allow us to do. So just to highlight the first one, in what ways can intersectional feminist practice and theory intervene and shape current and future DH projects, resources, and digital cultural heritage more broadly? Of course, DH is only one aspect of the creation of digital cultural heritage. So thinking in a kind of broader sense. We will share slides and there will be a recording so we can share those questions as well. I suppose it's also worth noting Audre Lorde's 1984, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So if we contribute to building the master's tools, do we still not dismantle the master's house? So how are we intervening, or how are we just replicating what already exists because we're not actually maybe, you know, we're not dismantling the tools, we are using them. And how much time do I have?
20 past now.
Okay.
Past 10.
Okay. I won't put too much longer. So thinking specifically Stack 1 data and archives, which I said is kind of very relevant to today's sessions. I start with a quotation by Klein et al. In Data Feminism 2020, what gets counted counts. And we can think about the way in which kind of archives have, again, it's kind of a term that has entered the zeitgeist. So people are talking about archives in very different ways, very different configurations, from the kind of very kind of traditional idea of archives to the kind of, kind of nuanced way in which people think about their own personal archives, or even the way Gmail archives an email for you. So there's a kind of way in which archives has been kind of like changed, consumed in very different contexts. But I wanted to kind of highlight what Jacques Derrida says in Archive Fever in the kind of like in the essay of the version of the lecture, actually. So no political power without control of the archive. There is no political power without control of the archive. Effective democratization can always be measured by this essential criterion: the participation in and the access to the archive, its constitution and its interpretation. But I kind of question, well, political power where? What types of system? And democracy for who or for whom? And in thinking about that, Kevin Guan's recent publication, Queer Data 2022, talks about kind of the ways in which archives and data of otherness is also presented in these things. So how the kind of otherness that is inherent in kind of traditional forms of archives is also part of the way in which we collect new data today. So thinking about how data is collected, the types of information that we're creating, which creates data sets. And they say when people we might now describe as LGBT were counted in historic data sets, it was often a result of observable actions understood as criminal to provide information on disease and mental illness. That always covers one thing. Or as a means to confirm difference and cement the privileges of the majority group. And while Guan is talking about the kind of historic development of certain data sets, there is a sense that we can think about how current data practices, data collection also contributes to that. So what are we confirming? What differences are we confirming? And what privileges are we cementing in terms of kind of majority groups and identities? And we might also think about the ways in which we construct archives, digital archives, or even physical ones, the way in which we access those, the kind of Western notion of access to information, the kind of, all data wants to be free. All data wants to be free within certain contexts. The open access movement states, information should be open, it should be reusable, but maybe not in all contexts, and maybe for not all communities. So within this context, we refer to the kind of FAIR principles of data management, and we add the CARE principles as well. So the CARE principles come from the kind of Indigenous communities of knowledge knowing and knowledge sharing. And what we want to do is we want to see how we can look at, developing alongside the FAIR and CARE principles and look at ways in which, access to information might be changed in development with certain communities. So I reference here the work of Daniela Bray with Shirley, who talks about the development of the Black Trans Archive. And in the kind of presentation that which I've put in here, interview with Daniela for the Black Cultural Archives, she states that this is not for you, this is for us. And at the very beginning of this kind of entry into it's a kind of gamified version of an archive. They ask you to identify yourself, and there's a level of trust in that identification. So 1, I identify as Black and trans. 2, I identify as trans. 3, I identify as cis. So me as a white cis person, I go to number 3, and there's a level of you could do whatever you want, but the system is saying, I want you to identify, and through that identification, you get a different kind of version of the archive, you get a different version interaction. And it's based on the idea that, not all information should be publicly available, and what publics are those anyway. And Daniela will be speaking at our IMA event in June 16th. And so we'll be publicizing that shortly. Yeah, okay. So we're delighted that Daniela will be able to be part of that. And I also kind of, in thinking about kind of like archives and data collection, there's also a kind of sense that Mark Hicks talks about hacking the system. And I was kind of thinking, well, what about hacking the sys terms? And if you look at the way in which we collect data, there is a kind of performance in the way EDI, so equality, diversity, inclusion, has become part of the ways in which we collect data information. And I've a screenshot there from CSO. Orla retweeted this when this was happening. So the Central Statistics Office in Ireland, what is your sex, male, female? So there wasn't a version or an ability for people who identify as non-binary to add their identity within that. And the people in the CSO office very unhelpfully said to people, well, if you tick both boxes, then that will be okay. And I think, Orla, you had said, there was someone else who had said,
yeah, there was confusion about whether that meant that you would be identified then as being non-binary, or whether it would be that they would randomly assign you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Randomly assigned. So that's great, isn't it? Fantastic. Yes. So thinking about autonomy in the way in which we describe ourselves is not always replicated in the kind of forms, the kind of data structures that are being developed. And I put this alongside this one on your right. So gender identity, male, female, non-binary, I use another term. And this is from, I didn't put in the kind of the branded, but it's a high street shop to sign up to their loyalty card. So it's kind of like, well, in what contexts are data collection and these types of questions important? And, is this kind of, as Sarah Anna talks about, this is asserting in some contexts an EDI performance and in some contexts backing away from it. But where these things are happening is important. CSO would have been better off asking this question rather than a high street pharmaceutical company. Why are they collecting it? Are they performing EDI? And Ahmed talks about this, the politics of diversity has become what we could call image management. So they're seen to be doing something that could be seen as EDI in terms of data collection. And then the question is, well, where does that information go? Where is that archived? Where is it stored? And then thinking about as well in terms of the digital humanities context, there is a sense that DH has traditionally kind of repeated the historical canon. So it's repeated the kind of Western canon that underpins kind of old systems of knowledge, and therefore reinforcing existing patriarchal power structures. And Rupika Risham, who's one of our advisory members, talks about this in a 2019 article and states that those of us who work with issues of difference often perceive the ways that many digital humanities projects fail to engage with race, gender, disability, class, sexuality, or a combination thereof. Some of the most developed humanities work preserve the writing of dead white cis men. So we want to think about getting away from that, or how do you challenge that? So how do we stop repeating history? And in terms of kind of like repeating history in terms of digitization on the one hand, there is a kind of a sense of AI repeating that history as well, as AI training models, neural networks, machine learning algorithms, the data sets that are used to create AI are often kind of relying on kind of, again, this kind of like traditional kind of old systems that are inherently oppressive and biased. And the work of Jack Ilwees looks at how you disrupt machine learning algorithms by querying the data set. So there's a link to their project here, the Zizi show, the deepfake drag cabaret. I don't think I have time to show it, but it's an amazing clip where they talk about, the inherent bias in these data systems. And what they've done is they created one of these, they've taken the kind of data set of one of these neural networks and flooded it with drag performers, their images. And then in that sense, they query the data set. What comes out of that is very important and very kind of useful to think about the ways in which we can intervene, the data sets that we're using and replicating. And I'm going to finish there and just to say that in terms of what we want to think about in Stack 1, this is just the one Stack data and archives. We want to think about how we can unweave repressive narratives and reclaim the archive itself as a tool which no longer categorizes, but rather continuously unfixes, de-archives and re-archives through non-hegemonic models. And this is from Archive Books, who is an arts collective. And I'm going to leave that there. So this is our Twitter, website, and mailing list. Do that.
Okay, so hi everybody here in Maynooth and online as well. So Sharon's kind of talked about the Full Stack Feminism project, and I suppose what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about connections and collaborations and the various threads that led us to the seminar today. And it's kind of like a kind of personal, threads, but also just what today is kind of all about, really, for me. And it's kind of bringing together lots of different things, because it's like Jeneen was saying, I'm kind of constantly wearing these two hats of that the work that I do with the Cork LGBT Archive, and most of the people I think know me in terms of that work, but then also working with the Full Stack Feminism project as a community coordinator. And those things actually, I think, kind of mesh together quite well. So it's about kind of just trying to look at some of those connections and collaborations. And when I started out on my journey of creating a queer community archive, at that time, there were very few people doing any work like this in the Irish context. So we did have, and we do have Sarah Phillips with the Irish Trans Archive and Tony Walsh and others with the Irish Queer Archive, but there were very few people developing queer digital archives in the Irish context. And so I needed to find people to help me to do that. I needed, models of how to do it and connections and collaborations to kind of feed and inspire and enable me to do that work. And so back in 2015, I heard about the Arizona Queer Archive and got in touch with Jamie Lee, who's going to be talking here today. And I think it was just so amazing that the way that I kind of, as somebody doing this archive in Cork, in Ireland, reaching across the Atlantic to people doing queer archives in the States in particular, and just the level of support and encouragement that I received. So Jamie sent me their PhD thesis, never heard of me before, but sent it over to me. And, it was really just one of the pieces of research that really informed the work that I do and helped me to understand what it was I was trying to do and led me to calling myself a queer archival activist. And anybody who's ever heard me talking about the Cork LGBT community has heard me quote Jamie about queering the archive. And for me, why this was so important was that it's not just about adding in queer topics, but that it is about querying how we do archival work and challenging the kind of the doing and the structures and the kind of theories behind how we do these kinds of archives. And for me, it kind of resonated with Gerda Lerner's work that's always in my mind as well when I'm doing this work, that if we're looking at the absence or the exclusion of women in history, that you don't just add women in and do it exactly the same way, that you actually have to look in a new way and in new places with new questions. So those things all really inform the work that I do. And then it's about connecting with that kind of ever-growing body of community archives that are doing what Andrew Flynn talks about we don't see ourselves reflected in traditional archives. Traditional archives are not neutral. We don't see ourselves there. So we end up creating our own archives so that our histories are told and our voices are heard, and so that the archives that we create reflect our lives and experiences. And then I stumbled upon Adela's work around art as coalition gesture, and again, it's about that whole bringing people together, and the work that we've done when we co-imagine, when we co-create. And I love that whole thing around queer world making. And this fits really well, I think, with the art strand of Full Stack Feminism. So I suppose, what I'm trying to talk about really is the kind of different strands that kind of lead us to having a seminar then on feminist and queer practices, on archival bodies. And it is about queer and feminist archives looking in new ways, in new places with new questions. And it is about those connections and collaborations that feed us in that work. We were talking a lot last night about the various LGBT AMS conferences. So AMS are archives, libraries, museums, and special collections. So there's been a series of LGBT AMS conferences in Amsterdam, in London, in Berlin. And at the opening of the AMS conference in Berlin, the first thing that was said was, "We are family." and this is our family reunion. And to me, that really resonated because it is about those connections and how we inspire and encourage and motivate each other in the work we do. We come from different perspectives with it. We're doing that work in lots of different places. But that connection, those collaborations are so important for feeding projects. And then kind of moving on then to a seminar that Sharon organized in Sussex in 2018, which again kind of brought together people doing so much innovative archival and historical work in lots of different ways and focused on so many different kinds of communities. And then kind of again, I see for me, you know, it's kind of, this is building in stacks for me as well, you know, around then the IFTI network, kind of looking at those intersections again and bringing people together. And I suppose my involvement very much with the IFTI was in terms of the community archiving workshops and looking at what's feminist archiving, what's queer archiving. And then with full stack feminism, then building on top of that. So I'm using the stacks in a different way, but I suppose it's just that journey of, for me, how we got to being here today. And, you know, I'm not going to go into the full stack feminism too much because I think Sharon kind of covered that adequately. But I suppose it is for me from that journey in 2015 to, you know, where I'm reaching out to Jamie, saying, you know, I'm trying to do this. How do you do it? How do you do the queer archive in Arizona? And then actually coming to the place where we're all coming together now to explore what is it that we mean by feminist and queer archives? How do we do that? And what are the things that we can learn from one another? So I suppose I'm just really excited that this has come together and that we're here to be able to explore that together. So very quick. So thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. And I'm going to just stand back a little bit so that you can see my head. Maybe I'll sit, will I? Might be better. Okay. So now I'm very small. Okay. So my name is Izzy Fox, and I'm the postdoctoral researcher on the project. And I'm just here to introduce Jamie Lee, and who's going to give a talk on producing the archival body. And Jamie's an associate professor of digital culture, information and society, and director of graduate studies, School of Information at the University of Arizona. And they direct the Arizona Queer Archive, the Digital Storytelling and Oral History Lab, and co-directs the Climate Alliance Mapping Project. They're an award-winning social justice documentary filmmaker, archivist and scholar committed to decolonizing methodologies and asset-driven approaches to community participatory projects that are produced with communities in ways that will be relevant and beneficial. So we're very happy to have Jamie with us today. So I'll just pass over to Sharon now. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Okay, let's see. I think, yeah, got it. Yeah. So. Yeah, I'll probably sit just because I have super bad vision and I have a script. So, all right. So here we are to share our screen keynote. No, we don't want to do a free update at this time. All right, so welcome everybody and welcome everybody. So thank you so much for having us, and also thanks for inviting us to present while we're here and traveling on sabbatical research, and it's so good to be together, and also so good to meet so many.
Irene, mute yourself.
Also, so good to meet everybody that I know on social media and I know through scholarship. So it's been fun now to see people in person. So today I'll be presenting on my research, and my recently published book, Producing the Archival Body, is the first solo authored research monograph published in the Studies and Archives series from Routledge Press. And it's loosely based on my dissertation research and grew into something quite personal and filled with storytelling from my perspective as a queer archivist, activist, oral historian, and scholar, as well as partner, co-parent, or Papa J, as our girls call me, neighbor, friend, and colleague. And I wanted the book to be centered in storytelling. So I met with a colleague from the creative writing program at the University of Arizona to seek advice on weaving such research about archives and archival practices through my own experiences with founding and building the Arizona Queer Archive. So he told me to, jot down notes of what stories connect and demonstrate my theoretical and practical pursuits, and then just start writing. So I wrote, then I wrote more, and I wrote for just over a year and into a pandemic, as well as in the midst of the killings of so many Black, Brown, and Indigenous people at the hands of the police and through the structures of violent, entrenched racism in the United States. I felt the urgency to write and connect and bring archives and bodies, human and non-human bodies, including bodies of knowledge and bodies of evidence, together in this work. So I begin with this quote from Emma Pettis's book, The Decolonial Imaginary, Writing Chicanas into History. She writes, quote, "Breaking out of the borders is like choosing to go outside, into the margins, to argue or expose that which no one will risk. It means traversing new territories and disciplines, mapping fresh terrains." So I repeat, traversing new territories and disciplines, mapping fresh terrains. And I entered the writing of this book through research I knew, through my hands-on experiences as a documentary filmmaker, and also of developing a community-based archives, as well as through storytelling in my efforts to make my ideas accessible. For me, new and fresh terrains mean that we need to unlearn and relearn even how to move through and over the new and the imagined together. And this is what I'm indexing when in the introduction of producing the archival body, I write, "At the end of this book, you and I will both be different." So I will walk today through the key theoretical concepts in my scholarship and my work as a community archivist. And I'm so grateful to one of my mentors, historian and trans scholar, Susan Stryker, for teaching me about soma techniques, which is the approach to the soma, the body, as it is already bound up with technologies, techniques, and techniques that influence how the body knows and responds to the world around it. The body offers a foundation for understanding and knowing one another, and our bodies are participants in all we do and all we make and know. Our bodies become a starting point for dialogue and understanding. And I ask about the many bodies that produce and are produced by mediating archival practices. As archivist and archival studies scholar, the Arizona Queer Archives has been one of my sites of inquiry. And how do archives and bodies mutually shape one another? What are the material, lived, and relational consequences for particular bodies and for archives? And how might a shifting archival paradigm support multiple narratives rather than an adherence to a singular history? And what might a new model mean for subject and archival formation, especially for peoples from non-dominant communities who have not been invited to partake in producing their own archival records, or who are often disciplined to do so in sometimes culturally irrelevant ways? So I bring archival theory and practice into conversations with theories of the body to introduce new understandings of what I call the archival body. And I ask what a framework of the body can offer archival studies as a discipline. A focus on the body holds social movement potential while also centering the body at the level of belonging to a collective history and the archives. Community archives hold a place in human rights conversations, and especially with the body as a framework. And I believe that community archives hold the potential for transformative change. Community archives in the emerging subfield of critical archival studies brings critical cultural theory to play in and on archival theory to question and challenge power dynamics and those historical structures that obscure or erase non-dominant histories, ways of knowing, bodies and bodies of knowledges. So I draw on queer theory in my work, as Orla mentioned earlier, to challenge the status quo and to insist on reimagining multiplicities and relational contexts. My research insists that the archives is alive and always in motion and always becoming. I argue that we can no longer be complicit in the production of the privileged archives. In my work, I use queered with a / as you see here, to highlight the temporal movement between a present and a past tense verb. The word choice is deliberate move toward the verb to queer, to subvert the normative. The / for me represents the taking apart and simultaneous coming together. What this means for the archives, and here I'm calling on scholars such as Jasbir Puar, Elizabeth Freeman, Jose Munoz, Jonathan Alexander, and Jacqueline Rhodes. The archives is that queer becomes a part of the foundation of the archives and how it is thought of, how it is created. Queer disrupts the traditional ideas of what an archives is and does and can do. The queered archives is living and breathing, and the histories cross the past, the present, and the future. Queer theory in the community archives that I founded means that the archive staff, volunteers, interns, and I critically and together question each step that we take, from processing, naming, digitizing, and making our collections accessible to our communities and our neighbors. Together, we return to the queer and queer theory to interrogate our hands-on work. To reiterate, archival theory pushes for fixity, to secure records and collections into a certain historic context. And queer theory, crashing into archival theory, makes urgent the need for flexible, moving, dynamic, and ongoing archives and archivists too who can be flexible. Queered archives and their flexibility and simultaneous becoming and unbecoming might transform understandings of evidential quality from enduring to also endearing. The affective becomes a key component to how I do the work of the archiving and how I teach the work of archiving. And I consider storytelling an approach through multiplicity that can encompass telling, listening, and sharing, as well as connecting, assembling, and also disassembling community. For me, when conducting oral history interviews, new relationships emerge. I focus on relationships and the relational aspects of storytelling. I consider the contextual elements of what the storyteller decides to tell and what not to tell. Understood as both relational and selective, storytelling heavily influences and is influenced by archival records, including the presences and the absences within the archive. It is a function of the narrative that is told, experienced, and then researched and crafted as history. So for me, storytelling is centered on relationality, and as Robin Wall-Kimmerer also suggests, reciprocity. It is a relationship that we enter into as storyteller and as listener together. And you'll see the fonts are a little goofy here because I use a different font, and then bringing Keynote into another computer without that font kind of makes it not quite work. So just piece it all together. All right, yeah. So into okay, good. All right. Phew. So all right. So in 2008, I founded the Arizona Queer Archives, the AQA, which is Arizona's first LGBTQ archives. And back then it was just an oral history archive. And then in 2011, I expanded it into a physical and digital space. The AQA continues to grow and is now a decentralized and distributed archives with collections spread across both community and institutional contexts. I built the AQA as an archival laboratory so that students and community members can work in the archives side by side. And together, we're all learning about the ways that normative top-down archival theory and practice, from appraisal, description, and even outreach, do not always and really cannot apply to non-dominant communities. So we're trying to be creative and think through these ideas. So the AQA, as a community archives that centers queer theory as a framework to intervene in traditional archival practices, is grounded in a sense of justice. The AQA is committed to making change for the communities it collaborates with and represents. The AQA is also committed to making change in the archival studies discipline to center community archives as rich sites of knowledge and so research. To demonstrate how the AQA is a site of research, here's a recent collaboration called the Pop-Up Archives event. And for this event, I partnered with FAR, which is the Feminist Action, Research, and Rhetoric Group, a coalition of feminist scholars and activists of public rhetoric, originally founded in 2008 by Adela Licona. as an action group to respond to events of regional and national significance. And together we asked, what happens when we take archival collections out of the archives and we perform them in the streets? So drawing from the Southwest Feminist Reunite Group's archival collection, which consists of digital video, oral histories, photographs, feminist journals, poetry, the 1971 edition of the Boston Health Collectives, Our Bodies, Ourselves, the planning documents for Nourishing Space, which is a lesbian land collective, t-shirts, and just so much more. We recognized that this was the most comprehensive and complex set of narratives of Tucson's feminist and lesbian feminist histories. And the women whose oral histories we recorded for the AQA, they started childcare center, women's centers, women's health centers and shelters, domestic violence programs, a feminist bookstore, and also a local food co-op. And they also promoted women's voices in the local male-dominated media. Again, here's the wonky text. So we made a map of the spaces that were important to the Southwest feminist work in the community, and we selected 4 local places that were easy to move between as part of a small tour. And at each site, actors, which consisted of students, faculty, and community folks, they performed the excerpts from the oral histories in the spaces where these lesbian feminists conducted their social justice work back in the early 1970s. And so lesbian feminists whose oral histories were being performed sat in the audience that day. They were moved and they wept. Their histories and stories were important enough to be retold. The addresses on the map still don't display any sort of county or city plaque marking the space, but the participants that day know this neighborhood differently. The feminists understand their histories in these places differently. And animating the archival collections in the communities themselves moved us all in ways to know differently. So next I'll turn to introduce you to one of my favorite collections in the archives, P. Carl's Transitional Eyewear, which consists of 28 pairs of glasses that P. Carl wore for over 4 decades of his life. And in my book, I write about the collection as a whole and also individual pairs of glasses that have moved me and how I've experienced them. So I introduce in the book a kaleidoscopic framework of the body to consider the embodied ways we know ourselves, our bodies, and the world around us in and through the abstract, unsettling, surprising, and beautiful bits and pieces that we find in the archive. For me, P. Carl's collection instantiates the practical engagements with archival embodiments. P. Carl embodies the archives, his collection, and his histories, and in the archives, each pair of eyeglasses connects directly to P. Carl as, in the archival studies lingo, the records creator. P. Carl created this collection of records and has mailed them to the AQA to be archived and preserved. And each pair of eyeglasses also connects to the archive's visitors in ways that calls upon the visitors' lived histories and living perspectives. And for me, like, there are two pairs of glasses that remind me of, you know, when I was in my teens and I worked at the Dairy Queen. I don't know if you have a soft serve ice cream place here, but like making milkshakes and blizzards, and they'd all like have the smattering of ice cream across because, you know, you just are trying to make things fast. And they were totally from like the 1980s, and you can kind of see the brown pair on the right side closest to the frame. They're really big and round. So just thinking, you know, the time frames of when P. Carl wore these eyeglasses and also as part of their own transitioning body. So the eyeglasses are meant to be handled and experienced as P. Carl's collection, but also as something more. As archivists, we don't always know the more that visitors experience engaging with records and collections. So P. Carl wore these eyeglasses as they moved through identities from lesbian, butch dyke, that's how they identified when I met them in the late 1990s, queer, genderqueer, and now trans man. Each pair was an integral part of his body, and eyeglasses frame the face. Eyeglasses frame what is seen through them. They frame how we are seen wearing them, make a statement, they hold meaning. And in this collection, they represent changing identity, changing body, and changing eyesight, as well as changes to how P. Carl saw himself in the world around him, changing perspectives. So recently when I asked Pete Carl what he thought about his eyeglasses being in a community archives, he responded, "I love that my eyeglasses are in a community archive. I would have given them to Goodwill or something. And yet when I see them together in an archive, it makes me see my own story more clearly. I tried so hard to find the exact right pair of glasses to go with exactly the right haircut that would somehow convey to people that I was a man, or at least not a woman. And fashion more generally became an obsession. I feel like I could retire now if I hadn't spent so much money trying to show the world who I was. I was a full-time costume designer for myself. And I think this is something a lot of queer people can relate to. And there's something particularly symbolic about glasses. I can see you, but can you see me? I also wonder what stories people imagine when they see the collection. Who do they see behind these frames without a face?" And that was his recent response. This eyeglass collection is a circulating collection. I shared a creative writing class in which the graduate students studied storytelling in and through collections. And after this class session, they each designed their own curios cabinets with things, and they would go to flea markets and Goodwills and start to piece together ideas of collecting. They are often presented at fairs where the AQA has a table or a booth, and participants are in awe of the collection and then ask themselves what they are perhaps inadvertently holding on to that reflects their own lives. And there's an article on lesbian bedside tables that Rebecca Sheffield wrote, so if you have an opportunity for that. And so I talk about that sometimes when I present on the archives. And I'm like, well, why is it my bedside table holds so many tubes of Burt's Bees chapstick? You know, like I just can't get rid of it because it's like I have one little, I mean, there's enough for like 2 more days in this tube, you know, so that's one of the things that I've been trying to, you know, take care of my own housekeeping. And then Adela C has shared the collection with the Tucson Museum of Art docents in a training about identity and perspective. So with the name Transitional Eyewear, the collection demonstrates the temporal understandings that are required in archives to be flexible and dynamic so they can adequately work with non-dominant communities to hold their lived and living histories. Circulating collections is an unusual practice and records might get damaged or lost. However, it's important for some things to be touched and to be worn and to be fully understood as significant and also made familiar. So this collection is also an open collection that keeps growing as P. Carl gets older and gets new glasses. And I have 6 new editions at home on my desk that need to be photographed and put up into the digital repository before we add them into the larger collection. And P. Carl says that he could write a book on each pair of these glasses. So I'd like to just end my presentation with my most recent Digital Humanities project. And I began my work in archives as a documentary filmmaker. Stories and storytelling are at the heart of my life's work. So when Adela and I met in 2005, I screened 2 of my earlier film projects in her classes, and we talked about their theoretical and political significance. And our conversations inspired us to collaborate on a project where we worked with communities to document practices of environmental, economic, and cultural sustainability along the US-Mexico border in El Paso and Juarez area where Adela grew up. And this was the start of our collaboration. So in 2006, Adela, her brother Miguel Mario, who's a science pedagogue, and I, the project titled Agua Miel, Secrets of the Agave as a feature film project. So we met and we interviewed a number of people from different community collectives and organizations in Texas, New Mexico, and Northern Chihuahua that Miguel Mario already had relationships with. And we documented what women were doing in Juarez to conserve water and to promote community health. And our film participants and collaborators shared their experiences and how they knew and understood their lands and their histories together. They told stories of deep lived knowledges, lived histories of their lives and their parents' lives, their grandparents. They shared long histories and sensual knowledges and understandings of place and time. And as technology shifted and the capacity to stream media efficiently on the web became affordable and accessible, we revised how we understood the project, and we envisioned it then as a digital humanities and community project that could continue to grow as we connected with more and more communities along the US-Mexico border. So today the project is called Secrets of the Agave, a climate justice storytelling project. And it centers everyday stories from the US-Mexico borderlands and now extends into California, Baja California, Sonora, and Arizona. And people of color and those experiencing poverty along the border are disproportionately affected by climate change and climate change mitigation policy. And their everyday stories, experiential, traditional, and sensual knowledges, however, are missing from the data. Their presence is only based on deficit-driven demographics. So this project highlights their distinct cultural perspectives that offer, fortify, animate, and complicate the data sets. As artist and researcher Mimi Onua suggests, quote, "That which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention to." It's in these things that we find cultural and colloquial hints of what is deemed important. Spots that we've left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences, unquote. So this project actively intervenes in those indifferences. Secrets of the Agave is inspired by the Colored Conventions project that brings together an informational website, educational modules with distinct archives platforms, and with a faculty fellowship from the Howry Program for Environment and Social Justice. I'm in the process of building the website, secretsoftheagave.com, and have received digital Borderlands grant like just a week and a half ago to fund and support graduate students who will help build the participatory archives using Omeka. And I'm working with Adela too in coalition with community teaching partners and design justice experts who are all committed to co-creating educational modules that lift community voices and visions and can be broadly accessible across technological devices in school and community classrooms and other local contexts. So this project is a working model for fostering interactions, lessons, and solutions across local and transnational contexts. It features everyday experts as primary resources in identifying, collectively combating, and also reimagining climate change through practices of ecological and community sustainability. So Secrets of the Agave, which insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate change impacts, is at its heart. Secrets of the Agave embodies a sense of justice. And that's all I have today. You can learn more going to the storytellinglab.io, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and also for the wonderful hospitality that we've experienced since arriving. To begin with, breaking bread is a beautiful gesture that I don't take for granted. I also want to thank all the invisible labor that goes into creating these events. The actual labor of cleaning and preparing the room and in preparation for us to arrive, and also in cleaning the room after we're gone. Just gratitude to everyone who makes this possible. Muchas gracias. I come to you from Arizona, the traditional homelands of the Tohono people, the Pasquayaqui and the Yoeme.
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. No. Are we good?
You have a team at this moment.
I can't. I wish you could travel with me everywhere. I am thrilled to be here today. I want to introduce everyone to a framework for working in and building community in what I call reciprocal relations. The framework is art as coalitional gesture. It means to bring together writers and artists, music makers, gardeners and dreamers to queer world make, to create in coalition and for informed action. I also want to share what I mean about the idea of moving matter. By that, I mean knowing and knowing together matters that should move us to act, moving matters. It also means to share information to build social movements. I'm going to use a participatory arts project I've co-designed to animate these concepts and to confront, I designed it actually to confront state violence. The project I'm going to be talking about today is called Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna. If there's time, perhaps in questions and answers, I can introduce a second project that actually after last night, I think is probably even more appropriate for the topic today. But it's a virtual toolbox that functions as a manifesto. It's a collaboration with writers, digital and design justice folks, and participating community members as everyday experts. So in developing collaborative projects such as Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna, I'm aware of how I ask others to join me. And in art as intervention, as coalitional gesture, and as a call to what I refer to as relational proximities, relationships of care and informed action. And in this case, again, to confront state violence and to create and share resources, which is an important part of the framework. It's also to build comunidades of care, which I've heard you all reference today. So next, I want to share the story of Rabia Tierna. And it's a story that begins on a summer day in June 2018. And let me make sure I'm right with my slides. Yes. I was taken aback by a photo that circulated widely in the United States of a little child, a little girl perhaps, captured in what looked like and felt like a cry of utter anguish, terror, really. It's the image of a child being separated from the adult with whom she was traveling. The camera used to produce the image was focused on the child. The legs of two adults around her were in the frame, but viewers could not see the faces of the adults. One pair of legs was dressed in a shade of khaki that immediately makes my stomach clench. It is the khaki of an armed border authority. It is a uniform that takes me back to the place of my childhood where I was raised along the border that divides and defines El Paso Juarez on the US-Mexico border. Though my own mixed race family lived with privileges and that citizenship imparts, we collectively feared that uniform. We held disdain for it. It was then the uniform of what we called La Migra. The anguished child comes back into focus for me. What feels like a cold breeze is captured in the photo's frame, blowing her hair across her tiny, wet, and terrified face. The child stands between a truck and the legs of the woman who's rehearsing that position that people of color especially are taught in the United States, have learned to take, brown hands visible, a striking contrast against the white truck, unmoving. Behind her, a lavender latex gloved hand at her waist, the hand attached to the body of the armed man dressed in khaki, border controller. His is a menacing stance, powerful, hers submissive, powerless. The power of the gloved hand and the body it belongs to and the utter vulnerability of the submissive stance are each, both, and differently palpable. I swallow. Can I actually taste this scene? Yes, I can. It is distasteful. My eyes return to the latex glove. A memory of the shame of the word dirty comes to mind. Dirty Mexican, a commonplace phrase used in the borderlands of my childhood. I'm reminded too of Mayor Tom Lee, a germaphobe and a xenophobe who instigated a practice of delousing and forced bathing for day laborers who entered El Paso from Juarez on the footbridge every day. Like the most recent past president of the United States, Lee manufactured fear and suspicion of people entering the US from the South. Because of Lee, migrants and their clothing were regularly fumigated with Zyklon B. David Romo, author of Ringside Seat to a Revolution, writes about this delousing practice along the US-Mexico border and its long insidious history. I was overwhelmed and outraged. I witnessed and felt the outrage of others. I recognized the strategic rhetoric deployed by those in power in an effort to domesticate this growing outrage by introducing an absurd notion of something that they called tender care and tender age facilities. Tender age facilities may have child-sized beds, but they are for-profit jails, connecting the prison industrial complex to the migrant industrial complex. They are an industry proliferating in the United States. They are cruel, they are brutal. In them, children are not only separated from the adults with whom they are traveling, they are neglected, they are abused, they are caged, and they die. I wondered though, why that particular photo and why at that moment? Having long thought about the matter of timing and opportune moments, especially in social movements, I realized this was my own opportunity, what in rhetoric we understand through some of the ancients as the kairotic. I knew I wanted to work with the momentum building around that particular image, to do something and to do something while the public around me was stirred, before the movement and the moment dissipated. As a photographer, my impulse was to return to the border with camera in hand. I did not want, however, to photo document what was unfolding there. I wanted to maintain a focus on the visual that seemed to be resonating so strongly with everyone. I wanted, though, to look and see differently, and this is where I started to imagine socially engaged art as intervention. I started to imagine the participatory element of the project as one that could work with the momentum that might express a coalitional gesture. I put out a crowdsourcing call to friends and friends of friends. I asked them to send me a photo of themselves as children. I also asked for declamations or declamaciones, or brief personal statements as micro stories that would reflect their relationship to the border and or its policies of division. I gave everyone 48 hours and told them I was hoping to quickly create a collective response to the most recent expression of adult and children separations at the US-Mexico border. I proceeded full speed ahead, but with my trusted internal light of caution blinking brightly and rather frantically. I first framed the project as one of family separation, while also explicitly troubling the notion of family that gets defined and reified by the state and the borders it invents, produces, and imposes and secures. Recognizing the power of the border to divide and define even the most intimate of ties, I wanted to leave room in the project for queer migrations, of families tied by choice, by material circumstances, by blood, by love, by lies, by imagination, and by necessity. Rather immediately, Ethna Levade emerged as a supporter and collaborator in this project. I knew and respected her thoughtful and meticulous scholarship on migration and queer migration in particular. I want to take a moment to share a few of the declamaciones that are part of Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna. I'll give you a moment to just see them there. These declamaciones gave me a clearer sense of the unfolding relational components of this project as they offer first-person responses to and lived related perspective on the specific cruelty that has long been enacted against adult and children migrants and refugees and indigenous people along the US-Mexico border. Declamaciones revealed long and brutal histories of separation and fears of separation from undocumented and queer migrants who faced and feared deportation, to trans participants whose identities are continuously threatened with, among more, official erasure, to Dene participants who were one generation removed from the traumatic separation imposed on Native communities through forced bordering school experiences, and on to those whose families held histories in the brutal internment camps in the United States, to people of color and working class participants who experienced ongoing displacements and dispossessions along the border. Collectively, the declamaciones that came in offer insights through micro stories and effective connections and relational contextualizations of the images that were also being submitted. They correspond directly or otherwise complement submitted images. As photographs and declamaciones came into me, I called on a local union print shop in Tucson. I asked if they could quickly produce large-scale images on sturdy cardstock. Here, it's once again important to note that the relational work we do along the way, how it functions in such opportunities to support coalitional projects in important ways. After offering the print shop preliminary insights into why I was collecting the images, the owner offered to donate and cut up pliable plastic materials used in the print shop's making of past protest signs to help the image cutouts stand as 3D figures. So these photographs, I created them as 3D figures. You'll see how they look in just a moment. But using the signs that the union shop gifted me from past protest campaigns, I made these 3D cutouts into standing figures. Folks from the print shop and I cut the signs into distinctly sized triangles. These became the stands for each of these figures. And I'm taking the time to mention this to you because it was in this moment that I recognized another connection and coalitional possibility. I could connect the struggle that I was documenting against family separation, of the pathologization and criminalization of migrant and asylum seekers, to the histories of LGBTQ persons and communities, and to LGBTQ liberation movements, as the triangle remains such a potent symbol to many of our communities. And those triangles then were functioned to hold these images up. people started to refer to these 3D figures as paper dolls. And I have to say, I didn't like the idea of calling these figures dolls. Slowly, however, I considered that such a conceptualization might tacitly remind participants and those viewing this project of the fact that we've all been children, albeit with very different histories, material histories, and with different consequences. It was in this moment that I could see and hope to be able to communicate the important ways that Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna connected as coalitional gestures to the legacies and living histories of slavery and settler colonialism, enslavements as well, insofar as the systems producing the conditions where families are refined and separated, brutalized, and children are treated as adults, expected to expend labor and otherwise behave in adult-like ways. Meanwhile, the crisis on the border continued to unfold. And here are some of the headlines from that time. And I won't read them all to you, but toddlers, babies held in tender age facilities after separated from families, tent shelters for older children expanding in the middle of the night. It was becoming clear that the United States government had no idea how many children it had separated and that it had no policy in place for reunification. In fact, in time, we would hear that the government acknowledged it was simply too hard to reunite families. Outrageous, yes, but not new. Tender Rage situates the then Trump administration's separation of migrant families in longer historical context, in the story of state-sanctioned violence, brutality, and dispossession directed towards families that are of color, indigenous, poor, queer, and gender non-normative. Together with Ethna Levade, Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna quickly became an intervention into received history, an act of public pedagogy. We co-wrote a contextualization of family separation as it was being manifested again along the US-Mexico border in 2018. And as it related to past practices of similar brutalities. We wrote of how forced separation of migrant families at the border fits into the United States' long and brutal history of treating enslaved families as property for profit, private property, whose members could be separated and even sold away from one another. We connected the practice to that of forcing Native American children into boarding schools and recalled how these were designed to violently strip away language, culture, identity, family, and community ties, and importantly, to treat young Native students as commodities that would also support a gendered and racialized economy. We considered the many ways immigration policies are designed to prevent immigrants of color from settling and forming families, how they can be punitive and connected to deeply inadequate social welfare policies, as well as to domestic policies that criminalize, punish, impoverish, incarcerate, and destroy poor, queer, indigenous, and racialized US citizen families, in part by cultivating a cradle-to-prison pipeline that makes the United States the most incarcerated nation in the world, and one where privatized prisons and privatized detention facilities are on the rise. And so we connected tender age facilities through the prison industrial complex to the migrant industrial complex. I created this website for Tender Age, and it's become an installation-ready exhibit with a resource component that includes how to be an immigrant ally and 15 actions that can shut down Trump's assault on immigrant families. We included a section titled Abolish ICE on the website. The site functions then as a toolbox of sorts. What did I just do? There we go. So as the website took shape, images and declamaciones continued to arrive. I turned my camera toward the 3D figures I'd created from the images submitted. The digital photographic scenes I produced deliberately evoke the specter, the shadow of the cage within which children are being separated and contained without using a cage. I didn't want to use the cage, in fact. I photographed outside, though. I hung part of the chain link fence above the frame for the sun to cast its shadow, as you can see there, on the scenes I was creating. The harsh desert sun cast the shadow of differing intensities across the cutouts I assembled. For each family portrait, individual and group cutouts are therefore differently marked by the cage's shadow falling over the images and against a stark white background. I was trying to communicate that we're all marked by the shadow of these cages in this historic moment, if differently so. Shadows over the cutouts invoke life being lived in the shadow of these cages. Bodies are differently marked by the cage and differently constricted, terrorized, and traumatized. The white background I use is meant to convey a space that is not defined, at once unfamiliar, unknowable, disorienting. A space and no space at once. The harsh white background instantiates too the legacy of white supremacy and its power to define and divide families. The cutouts placed in the midst of the stark white background and foreground also imply an overexposure that speaks to conditions for the expanding production of hypersurveillance practices and technologies at and near the border, and in spaces of incarceration and detention. The consummate starkness of the white background is also intended as an abstraction that highlights the callous conditions of radical isolation for children, for anyone forced alone or together into a cage. The production of such a background for the cutouts calls viewers to confront the stark conditions of any cage. The image is meant to evoke notions of family, but also of children cut out of family context, separated and decontextualized, which is what was happening to them as a result of both the forced migration and of the experience of enduring the violence of numerous states, the states they flee, the states they travel through, and the United States. In this cultivated context of nothingness, a flattened dimension and void are also produced through the stark white background, bound by that high intensity and highly stylized contrast of the heavy black frame that I use to border each photograph. The chosen frame implies, this particular chosen frame implies the many ways that the border is being insidiously reinforced and reproduced as a powerful instrument of division, control, containment, and death. So I started to get invited to travel with the exhibit, and I developed parameters through what I introduced at the beginning of my talk as art as coalitional gestures for pop-up installations. To make it even more intentional and local, I worked to make each installation and pop-up a site-specific or place-based socially engaged art project. And in this way, I connected to and through local stories to other relevant context. This is why I offer the land acknowledgement when I begin my work. It's not a gesture that does something today, but it's one that reminds us of land as a collection of stories so far. I believe we must keep telling these stories and reintroducing stories to acknowledge place and believe that knowing matters. Informed action is still ahead of us with regard to unceded lands. For pop-ups of Tender Rage, Rabia Tierna to function as coalitional gestures, then they must be in space, pardon me, that is accessible and inviting to a broad audience. So in the United States, that means not on campuses, but rather in community centers, spaces of social justice. In the case of this particular exhibit, migrant serving spaces or community arts centers that are knowable to migrants. They must include at least 2 local speakers. I'll never go as the singular speaker of any of these pop-ups. And those local speakers must be involved in and knowledgeable about local efforts to serve migrants and asylum seekers. They should be used as an occasion to fundraise for a collectively identified local migrant serving organization. Whenever I'm invited, I divide my speaker fees. I use mine simply to travel, but then I divide them in a collectively decided way with the organizations determined to be the one for which the event fundraise. So oftentimes I'll work with local community members to find out who most needs the money in the moment. And we can do the division right then and there. I also ask that a local resource page be developed in advance of the pop-up. So it takes some work before I get there. I post it on my website and on any online spaces dedicated to the event, as well as projected during the event, and I ask for it to be printed and distributed at the event. Intentional invitations to circulate by word of mouth and via social media networks. I say by word of mouth because sometimes working with vulnerable communities, we don't want online. And I think you all talked about this earlier. Not being open is not always fair, is I think how it was said earlier. That was beautifully said. Connection should be made and maintained across local, national, and transnational contexts. And this is that idea of reciprocal relationships. And a renewed commitment to keeping resources updated should be made. So in pop-up installations, I frame the portrait photos with heavy black electrician's tape. I do this to extend the contrast between in and out, and to highlight the ongoing oppressive powers of borders and border technologies. I also cut butcher paper into an island of sorts, and I place it on the floor of the places where I go with ragged edges outlined in electrical tape to evoke the cicatrices and heridas, or heridas abiertas. Cicatrices are scars, and heridas abiertas are open wounds that Gloria Anzaldúa notes when she looks at the border and talks about the border. I place the 3D cutouts therein, and I hang single strands of chain link that I then spotlight to cast the shadow on the exhibit and those who visit. And so I'm going to, so earlier I talked about that visual image, and I took the time to really try to tell you about it, but I didn't show it to you. And I actually refuse to reproduce the visual image of children being separated, and deliberately decided to use their cries instead. So I do use the sound, but not the visual. And I made this decision after one of a number of group conversations, including with friends and colleagues, because all babies cry. We're supposed to do something when we hear them do so. So I reached out to artists, more resources. I reached out to artist and noise studies scholar, John Melillo. And together, we created the final touch that sonically contributes to the affective cry of tender rage, rabia tierna. John and I approached sound as a vital component, but one which challenged us and gave us pause. We felt it inappropriate and overwhelming to simply record the cries of caged children. To the sound component, then, we added other sonic elements from soundscapes that I'd been gathering, including the howl of coyotes reverberating through canyons in the desert, the sound of cicadas, the wind, the mourning doves, and the wind, caged and crying children and birds in textures that resound as pure grief, anguish, and alienation. John listened to and combined these field recordings I'd made with some of his own, together with the cries of caged children circulating in mainstream media already. He focused on the noise of wind, which forms the baseline against which other sections of frequency timescapes are stitched together, and worked to create what he called a kind of quilt. And I thought that was very provocative because of the quilts that children were giving were mylar quilts that were not quilts at all, to wrap themselves in these cages. But let me get on to the soundscape, and I don't know how loud this is, but here goes. So the sound collage, and I didn't play it all for you, I know it's disturbing. It works together with photographs and text to express the sonic and sensory experience of collective outrage. By sounding the ecologies of division and displacement that cages and borders impose, the sound mixed here signals the haunting, lasting trauma and lingering terror that has been installed and inflicted on children and those who love them. Cries, those of the children and those we can collectively make, can be a call to action, to abolish ICE and to end the division and to know human rights. Tender Age Rabia Tierna is an outcry of collective outrage, an interventionist and participatory art project. It's designed to highlight these imposed oppressions that extend the injuries of xenophobic discourses and of anti-immigrant practices and emergent policies in the United States. I ask what art in the age of state violence and border brutality and in the regime of distortion, something I write about, can do. It can gather community, it can inform, it can teach, it can redistribute resources, and it can express collective outrage. It can document, it can function as a call to action and to imagination. It can connect people to one another, to resources, to ideas locally and across context. It can be experienced as moving matter, movement building matter. What else it does is up to us if we have the will to let it do something other than make the outrageous interesting or the brutalities beautiful. Thank you.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Now for, we've saved the best to last. We have, sorry, to put you under pressure. Lorraine Grimes, who's a member of the DRI team and also a postdoctoral researcher in Maynooth University. So take it away, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me speak here today. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this really, really cool event. So yeah, I'm a postdoctoral researcher based here at Maynooth University, and I work on the DRI project, which is Archiving Reproductive Health. And the aim of this project, I'll just, before I start, I should have shared my screen. And here we go. Yeah, it's like no. Yay.
No, it's not so soon. Sharon's not here. It's just showing that mode, which we don't want. We want the other mode. I'm not sure.
Sorry about this.
No, this happened. It happened with everybody.
Is it 100%?
I think that might be it now, is it?
Yeah.
So
we did it without Sharon.
lovely. Thank you so much. So the project aims to provide long-term preservation and access to many of the at-risk archives that are generated by grassroots women's reproductive health movements. We're particularly interested in the most recent referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment, but also to archive on reproductive health more generally. So previous referendums on abortion, but not excluded to just abortion, also campaigns around contraception and other reproductive health issues. So the project aims to ingest material from all collaborating organizations for long-term preservation in the digital repository, and to develop best practice for archiving social media. So this is something that is, I suppose, quite a new area for us. And I'll be talking a little bit more about archiving the In Her Shoes Facebook page a little bit later on. We are also carrying out research into best practice and ethics and the legalities of archiving this material, which is quite interesting. And one of the sources that we have developed as part of this project as well is a bibliography of sources in the area of research ethics and working with sensitive and potentially traumatic research, which I will talk about a little bit later on as well. And this bibliography is available on the DRI website. So some of the stakeholder organizations that we are ingesting at the moment include the Coalition to Repeal the 8th Amendment, the Abortion Rights Campaign, Termination for Medical Reasons, and To Get a Free Yes. And this material includes agendas, minutes of meetings, annual reports, policy submissions, as well as photos and logos. And we're really grateful to these organizations for generously donating this material for ingestion. And we're just delighted to have the main organizations involved in the campaign and to preserve this material long term. So another aspect is researcher data. And this is data, research data carried out by individual researchers on different projects. So one of these projects included Doctors for Choice, who carried out oral history interviews with members of Doctors for Choice. And so we have them in the archive now as well. Then there's the Real Productive Justice Project, which was carried out in NUI Galway. And this was interviews focused on reproductive rights for people with disabilities. And so we have these interviews also ingested. And then we also have a photo collection from Louis Strange, who is a PhD researcher, and he took photos of the streets mostly around Dublin of the time of the campaign, and it brings you back to how littered we were with posters at the time, and it actually really captures, I think, the heightened campaign at the time. And so then one of the data sets that we're also ingesting and have partially ingested now is the In Her Shoes collection, which, as I say, I'll talk about that in a second. So We have launched some material on International Women's Day this year in March, and we are having another launch on the 25th of May, so next week, to coincide with the anniversary of repeal. And so some of the researcher data sets include oral history interviews carried out by Linda Connolly, who's actually based in Maynooth University as well. And these were interviews from her PhD thesis back in the 90s, 1996. And she carried out interviews with women who had been involved in the women's movement in Ireland in the 70s. So we have those collections. Then we also have interviews from Mary Muldowney, who carried out these interviews in 2010, so prior to the most recent campaign. And she talked with people in the pro-choice movement from 1983 up to 2010. So we have those interviews as well. And then we also have survey data, which was carried out by Camilla Fitzsimons. And she carried out these surveys with pro-choice activists in 2015, 2020, and 2021, and their experiences of campaigning. So we kind of have the history, if you like, of the movement, like during the decades. So I just want to talk a little bit about archiving the In Her Shoes Facebook page, which has been a lot of what my day-to-day research has been on. So for anyone who is not familiar with the page, women submitted their stories on the Facebook page, and the stories capture the reality for many women living under the 8th Amendment and being denied access to abortion care in Ireland. And it offers an insight into the realities surrounding the illegality of abortion. And they provide details of being refused healthcare, barriers to access, experiences of travel abroad, illegally ordering the pills online, and the emotional impact of this. As a resource, it shares women's stories and it allows us to learn from them as a society as well. And some accounts are deeply distressing and include details of rape, domestic violence, and the emotional impact of being denied care. Working on this research, we were very mindful of the sensitivity of the research and the impact on me as the researcher and others who are working on this project too. So we know that working on sensitive research can increase the risk for secondary traumatic stress, and secondary traumatic stress refers to psychological symptoms that mimic post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is something that we talk about regularly on the team. And I suppose I just want to say that I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive supervisor who has been absolutely fantastic, Dr. Aileen O'Carroll. And she's been just so supportive, and we have we have check-ins regularly as well. So when we came to, I suppose, before we started working with the data, we had a lot of discussions around self-care and how we were going to manage the workload. So what we did was we actually designed a self-care protocol. So I think I have So basically, the protocol is to kind of minimize potential harm. And this is available on the DRI website now. And we encourage all archivists and researchers working with sensitive data to have a read of it and to develop their own self-care protocols. So one of the things that we did was we also we talked a lot about the ethical and the legal issues involved in archiving the Facebook content. And we also developed a ethics protocol as well as part of this project, which is also available on the web page as well. So, and we talked around issues involved in archiving, community activists, and processes that are ongoing. It's quite contemporary movement, and it changes all the time. So, and potential to harm to the community from archives, I suppose, and particularly with the Facebook archive, what that might mean. So, just to talk a little bit about the protocol. So basically, the first thing that I did when I started the work was to pace the work. And I started off by doing 30 minutes of work on the stories a day. So it involved reading 996 abortion stories on the Facebook page, which we had pulled from the Facebook page. So I sociologically coded them using a software in order to develop the terms. So it would be more useful for researchers when they're being ingested, and to have the subject codes, the subject terms based on the codes that I had selected when reading them. So the first thing I did was I started off doing 30 minutes a day, and then I increased it to 1 hour, and then I increased it to 2 hours. So so I usually did the work first thing in the morning in order to avoid doing it last thing at the end of the day. And another thing was regular team debriefings. And I also met with a researcher at Trinity College. Her name is Mandy Lee, and she's also she's doing research which is quite sensitive as well around the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And so we would check in with one another about once a month and just talk about our research, how we're getting on, and just unload. So that was very helpful. And then another aspect that I found particularly helpful was journaling. So after I would do my hour or 2 hours of coding, I would just write down how I felt, and even if it felt silly, I just, I kind of just wrote it down, and I found it very helpful. There were definitely some days where I was looking forward to doing the work and looking forward to getting into it, and then there was days, of course, where I absolutely dreaded doing it, and just kind of wanted to get it over and done with. But some of the things that I kind of found difficult were the number of women who had attempted suicide due to an unplanned pregnancy. And this was something that I didn't really expect, and it was something that we hadn't thought of as well. We knew that there was going to be cases of sexual assault and domestic violence, but I think that was something for me that I found quite shocking. And as well as that, the number of women who attempted miscarriage through self-harm, I found that particularly shocking as well. So these kind of things popped up at different times, and we talked through them, and we had a lot of conversations around what is the best way for us as archivists to add subject terms, and what is the best language to use. So in terms of rape, do we code that then as rape, or if the woman herself might not have used that term, but we can tell from the story that it is. So we're still having these discussions. It's still ongoing, and but it's very, very interesting, and I think it's something that really has yet to be explored probably further. Yeah, I think that's kind of everything that I wanted to say, but like looking forward to questions and do ask me anything. Thanks so much.